In question number 4, we have kind of an interesting situation because instead of giving us a bunch of information in the word problem, they're giving us an equation to use. And usually we have to write our own equation, so this is kind of interesting that they're giving us one to use, because maybe this time they want us to work backwards. Maybe this time they're giving us the equation and they want us to interpret the information. So the first thing I want to do is just read the question, make sure I have a sense of it. On the first day of school, there were 2,866 eager students ready to learn, but the number of eager students each day can be modeled by this equation. So I want to look at this equation more closely because maybe that gives me some hints about its pattern. The first thing I'm noticing here is that it has parentheses with a power of n. If you've done enough of these problems to recognize that structure, you may indeed be thinking of those formulas that we've written before for the geometric versus the arithmetic style of sequences. And I'll ask you to take a look and compare. You see that power of n? Arithmetic equations don't have powers of n. This is my notes from a couple of weeks ago, so I'm just looking back at them. Arithmetic equations don't have that power of n, but geometrics do. And that power of n is always the case with a geometric. So this is giving me a really big hint that I must have a geometric situation in this scenario. And because it's geometric, that must mean that I have a problem that has a multiplier or a multiplication style pattern. So that's a big hint right off the bat. Now, if I think about the geometric equation, I know that the number outside the parentheses is what we call the initial value, and the number inside the parentheses is the one we call the multiplier. So I'm going to label those things here. The initial value must be the 2,866, and the multiplier must be the 0.88. Now that does actually make sense, because remember how at the beginning of the question it says on the first day of school there were 2,866 students ready to learn? Initially, we must have started with 2,866. So it actually does make sense that that's what they're calling the initial value. But in letter A it says, is this an increasing or a decreasing sequence? And how would you know? It might not be obvious. If it's obvious to you, then you can of course answer this question with how you know. But if it's not obvious to you, here are some options. Option number 1, try some days. Think about some days and see if you can figure out if there's any sort of pattern. I'm going to organize my info with a table because I like tables and I think that makes things easier for me. So I'm going to look at this with a table. I'm going to say to myself, well, initially there were 2,866 students ready to learn. So what if one day later I wanted to figure out how many students there are? I don't really know what's going on, but I do know that there's a multiplier of 0.88, so I could multiply by 0.88 and figure out what's going on. 2,866 times 0.88 would be, according to my calculator, 2522. Obviously, we can't have 0.08 of a person, so I'm just going to call it 2522. And if I look at these numbers, 2522 is clearly smaller than 2866, which is tipping me off that this is probably a decreasing sequence because the number of students got smaller one day later. I'll check one more day because sometimes the first time is just a coincidence, so we always want to check at least one more to be sure. If I multiply by another 0.88, I get 2219. And again, can't have 0.43 of a person, so I'm just going to leave that as 2219. And then I tell myself, oh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, this is clearly decreasing because 2,800 students becomes 2,500 students becomes 2,200 students. That number is getting smaller and smaller. So this is a decreasing sequence. And where it says, how do you know? Just describe what you did. I personally would say, and I'm not going to take the time to write this all because you don't have to copy my words, but I would write something like, because I did a couple of days worth of the table and saw that the number of students was decreasing. You can think of this however you'd like. Now that you know it's decreasing, I'm going to challenge you for a moment. Can you figure out letter B or letter C? Both of these questions are doable if you have the equation to utilize or if you have the table. So think about that question and see if you can answer questions B and C on your own. If you can't, the next video will help.